Mike, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here.
Good to see you. So for the audience, Mike was on episode 348, and I believe we're at 566 here. 67. I can't even keep track anymore. Anyways, that was a long time ago. And if you want to hear Mike's backstory and kind of hear about how he came into the world of audio and his studio adventures, please check that out. That'll be in the show notes. For today, this is going to be an episode all about the thing that is your day gig that helps pay the bills. And for those that don't know, you are an electrician, and I call you my electrician. When I think of my,
Cool.
electricity, I think Mike Blodgett is my electrician, and you put in isolated grounded outlets here in my studio, and you've done other studios, and you do, of course, commercial work. But anyways, we're going to talk all about electricity and how it applies to pro audio studios, home studios, etc. We're going to dispel some myths. So, you're talking to us. It looks like you're in your attic at your house.
Yeah, it's my little composer setup I have here, not at the studio, which is a completely separate building. But yeah, this is pretty nice. I've got a little M Audio keyboard here and Apollo Solo, just for composing and coming up and being creative in the attic.
Okay, the first thing, the obvious question, I know the answer to it. I think most people would assume this. You probably don't do all your own electrical work.
I do.
From your home to your studio and everywhere in between.
Yeah. So my home projects were getting a little neglected, so I basically had to start scheduling myself as an electrician to come to my house to do the work. Found out that works, so I get things done.
Yeah. Do you leave the house and come back?
Actually, I do, because I have to go get my van, come back. Yeah.
Knock on the door.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. Shit, nobody's home.
Think I have a key.
Yeah. Break in. Anyways, I digress. So how did you get started as an electrician? What drove you to that profession?
It was kind of a fluke. So I've always had music as my primary goal in life. And I was maybe 19. No, I had just turned 21. That's right. I had gotten a job as a janitor. And the one day that the local union in Reno, Nevada, which is where I grew up, ran an ad for apprentices, happened to be the one day I got sick of my job and looked in the paper, and I thought, electrical. I like electricity, kind of find it fascinating. So I applied and got in, and 30 some years later, still doing it.
Do you find electricity a challenging thing, or is it fairly straight ahead?
When I first thought of it, I was thinking, you just plug things into outlets and make them work. And then I figured out, we're actually installing the outlets for people to plug things into. Okay, this is a whole new system. It's fairly complicated, actually. It's interesting. Probably the best thing that sort of sorted it all out in my head was one of the journeymen at the time said, electricity is easy. You just got to follow the flow of electrons. It somehow made sense in my mind, so it kind of cleared it all up. It's fascinating. It's got a lot to do with signal flow in recording, actually.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Yeah, so the two do go hand in hand somewhat.
Let's talk about myths. What are some myths that you come across on a regular basis that pro audio people tend to propagate and just talk about all the time, and you find yourself correcting them?
Well, it's not necessarily a myth. It's more of a getting the naming wrong. So the biggest thing that comes in is the difference between a dedicated ground and an isolated ground. A lot of people think that the isolated ground is where you have to put a separate ground rod in the ground and do all that, but that is actually a dedicated ground when you're adding a ground rod. Most studios, you're going to want an isolated ground system. You don't have to drive a separate ground rod or do anything like that. An isolated ground does not have a separate ground rod. What it does have is an isolated ground wire So electrically, all your stuff that plugs into that outlet has a clean ground going right from the outlet back to your main panel, which is where all of your grounding for your system originates. And that's to separate your electric ground from, say, your building, all of your boxes, anything metal, your plumbing, anything that could create an RF interference coming into your equipment. Really, that only comes into play if you have a lot of outboard gear. If you're doing everything in the box, doesn't even matter. So that's the main thing, is the difference between a dedicated ground and an isolated ground.
And the benefit of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, let's say at my house where I have my mixing room, there's a refrigerator. It's grounded to like maybe the outlet is grounded to the box
Right.
itself. And
Exactly.
and therefore there's all this ground activity on all the metal parts of the house that are potentially interconnected,
Right. Well, they should be. Yeah.
ideally.
Yeah.
And so if you have an isolated ground, you're going straight from the outlet, you're going home run right to the bar in the breaker
In
box.
the main panel. Yes.
In that particular case, do you still run the risk of noise on the line because don't all the grounds ultimately come back to that bar, or is that not accurate?
They do, but you're bypassing the big antenna, as it were,
Mm.
of all your grounded stuff in your house. It's like you have an umbrella and your rain's coming in. You're still maybe gonna get wet, but your isolated ground is kinda like a tunnel going straight through, which completely isolates you from the rain or the noise, as it were. That's my best analogy I got.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, we'll go with
Yeah.
that. And those outlets, is there a particular reason why they're orange?
They don't necessarily have to be orange. Really, the thing is the little green or black triangle on them. They started out as orange outlets, I guess, so you could just tell that they were isolated ground from afar, but you can actually get them in any color you want. There is a little triangle mark on the outlet that uh, shows that it is an isolated ground outlet.
Okay. Now, what would be the case of using a dedicated ground rod?
So that just adds kind of another level. That would be more if you're in an industrial area where there's a lot of motors going on and you just really have to separate your grounded system from the neighborhood, really. Um, so it's just kind of a bigger separate option, I guess,
Mhm.
step that you could take. Really, if you've got that bad of a ground noise situation, you're probably gonna wanna put in an isolation transformer, which is a one-to-one ratio. It electrically separates your system, physically separates it from the neighborhood, all the noise that's going on. And in that case, you do have to you still need a ground, so that's where your isolated or your dedicated ground comes into play. Um,
So that means that the electricity enters the building, and does it go to a breaker box
yeah,
first?
yeah, it still goes to your breaker box, then it goes into the transformer. The transformer, since it's an electrical connection, not a physical connection, um, physically separates your system from the grid system, so you don't get the greater noise from the neighborhood, as it were.
Right. And we watched a little bit when you were over at the house, last week or the week before. I was showing you a bit about, Greg Norman at Electrical Audio in Chicago is walking me through in a tour, and he was talking about their issues with ground because they were in a fairly industrial mixed use area. Therefore, you definitely couldn't set the studio up to be mechanically grounded because there's just too much interference from everything. And
Right.
then you couldn't do isolated grounds per se because there's still too much uh, activity in the system on the grid, so to speak. So they have an isolation transformer and they have a separate ground rod.
Exactly. Yeah, so basically built in the worst case scenario area, but they were able to install a system that could isolate them from the greater noise of the neighborhood. So that's pretty cool.
So would you say that it's for the audio professional, they have to consider where they're actually setting up shop?
Right, exactly. And it also scale comes into play too. So if you have multiple rooms that are tied together in a big facility, such as electrical, um, audio, I mean, that kind of brings in a whole nother idea of like, say, a star ground where all of your grounding from your rooms is basically has the same length, comes to a central point, and then goes to your ground box or dedicated ground rod. That, yeah, that adds a whole nother level of things. But for a small one room facility, just get a nice isolated ground with a nice power conditioner, plug everything into that, you should be good to go. In a lot of cases, especially if you're in a residential area, you're probably not even gonna need that.
Right, because, unless you're talking about, on the weekend, maybe you've got a neighbor who's got some tools in their garage and they're building stuff, like, and they've got saws.
It could potentially come into play, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. One thing that I encountered, and tell me if this is if I'm making stuff up here, but when I first moved into this place, I had my gear was there wasn't enough gear in here to justify plugging into more than one outlet. I plugged in a power conditioner to one outlet, and that was it, and the system was as quiet as it could be, and my understanding of that is that if I were to split off into 2 separate outlets that had different grounds, that's when ground hum gets introduced.
Yes, exactly.
So, if you're in a residential situation, um, while it may be convenient to plug into different outlets, like say you're in an apartment, let's say you're in New York in an apartment, it would seem to me to make sense to have a power conditioner, you plug everything into that and then plug that one outlet or that one plug into a single outlet to avoid ground hum.
Yes, exactly, and that should do the trick, really.
So that brings us to, different ratings of circuits because you put in a 20 amp circuit
Mhm.
and I had been plugged into a 15 amp circuit for a long time. Can you talk a little bit about potential, problems with, too much gear on a 15 amp circuit? What does that mean when it's a 15 amp circuit or a 20 amp circuit? Just to even get deeper.
Yeah, that's the amperage is just the capacity of the circuit you're using. Um, 20 amps, you have 55 amps more capacity than a 15 amp circuit. So if you overloaded the 15 amp circuit with gear,
Mhm.
hopefully your wiring is correct for that 15 amp, and it should be. It'll just trip the breaker. Then you know, oh my gosh, I got too much plugged in. Uh, in which case you would have an electrician come out and install a 20 amp circuit, which you generally requires all new wiring because it has to be rated for 20 amps, not 15 amps.
And we were able to do that in my room because you ran all new wiring.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. And also part of the danger is if you're plugging in even if you're plugging into the one outlet, let's
Mhm.
say you're in a studio apartment and on you're in the main room, you plug into one outlet, that one outlet could be sharing the circuit with the refrigerator
Right.
or a heater in the bedroom
Yep.
or a
And
hair dryer, in the
in the
bathroom.
bathroom, totally. Yep, and that all could bring noise into the system.
Bring noise and or flip the breaker.
Right, yep, exactly.
Are there tools to kind of figure out on the non-electrician side, like, what you're plugging into? Like, if you come into a place and you're like, "Oh, okay, there's a couple three-prong outlets and the rest are old two-prong outlets." Like, what do you
Right.
do in those situations?
They do there's a simple tester that you can get from, any Ace hardware, it'll plug in and it'll tell you whether you have a ground or not. Uh, there's 3 lights on the thing, 1 lights up if your hot and neutral are correct, 1 lights up if you have a ground. between your hot and neutral, and the other one lights up. You don't want that other one lighting up. It just means you're neutral and you're hot or flipped around and you got some work to do. But yeah, so that's a simple way to tell whether you have a ground or not. There's really no way to tell other than knowing what your wiring is as to whether it's isolated or not.
Interesting. Okay. And there's, we always see like I've got this thing, this monster power thing that's showing me the incoming voltage, and it's got a couple lights on it. Like in general, are these just glorified power strips that we see in pro audio?
They are a step up from just a power strip. I'm not exactly sure how they're just a step up. There's some sort of conditioning going on in there. I'm just not quite sure what it is. I'd have to do some research on that.
Okay. And I guess I'm gonna duck my head down here to look at this monster thing. Yeah, it says protection on. There's an indicator for abnormal voltage. I've never seen that come on. There's
Right.
a clean power on. That's always on. A wiring fault, a grounding, okay, and then an LED readout or a digital readout of, it's going from like 125 down to like 120, and occasionally we'll dip down to 118 on certain days.
Right. Yeah. That's all a good range. Um,
So I assume things like that are maybe doing a little bit of filtering. There's dedicated outlets on the back that say this is good for power amps. This is good
right.
for digital things.
That's what I was gonna say. I looked it up real quick, and they are filtering out noise, regulating voltage, and it says here they filter noise, regulate voltage, and reduce other electrical disturbances
I don't know what
in the
that
floors.
means.
I don't either.
Electrical disturbances.
Right.
That's going to be
Maybe
my new band.
RF frequencies, yeah, coming in. Who knows? It's probably the filtering inside that takes care of most of the noise.
And I assume that the cheaper you get, the more you're kind of headed into the rack mount power strip land.
Right.
But then there's these more expensive boxes, like, the company Equitech has been around for many
Right.
years.
Yeah.
My understanding there is that there's a transformer in there and, uh, a bunch of outlets on the back, approximately 10-ish on some
Yeah.
of the boxes I've seen.
Yeah, so those are interesting. It is basically an isolation transformer, but it also does an electrical thing where you don't necessarily have a hot and a neutral, which your neutral could essentially start working as a ground and introduce noise. But it has two hots. You have a 50 volt on one side, 50 volts on the other. When they add, you get your 110 volts. Um, so that's adding another level of protection of clean power, as it were. And those are pretty cool. I installed one of those at Jeremy Goody's studio in Oakland, and he had nothing. I mean, they were great. He had wonderful, clean power until the cell tower moved in next door.
And audience, I'll put a link in the show notes to the last episode, that I did with Jeremy Goody, because Jeremy goes into great length about having a cell tower next door and the ramifications of that, so
Yeah. So, yeah, that and it basically just, comes into when he's using tube mics with tube, power, preamps. He can still do stuff with, um, non-tube, I guess I would call it,
right, so any
stuff.
kind of tube gear or
Yep,
vintage gear that's tube
yep,
is just out of the
yep,
question there.
and really the only way to solve that is putting a Faraday cage around his
His whole
studio, and
building.
yeah, and that's not gonna happen, so
Right.
he's found workarounds, but, it's not ideal.
And that's just a different thing altogether because we're going beyond electricity. We're going to wireless signals in the air that are permeating everything.
Yep, exactly.
Um, have you seen some silly setups for studios in the past that electrically speaking that they're doing stuff like we're having this problem and then you clearly see what the problem is?
Yeah, there was a a studio here in Oakland a while back, and they were having some issues with the amplifier. So they had me come in and check their ground system. It wasn't actually isolated properly. So I went through and fixed that, made sure they had an actual isolated ground, which helped, but it was still a noisy amplifier. There was really no getting around that. But it did help, so that was good.
Do you think that in the majority of cases, building codes, specifically in California, are of a nature that there's just certain things you can't get away with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Electrical codes, doing things to code, hiring a professional licensed contractor. Uh, it's set up to so you get it done right.
Other than, your regular 15 amp outlet and, maybe a 20 amp, um, really the only differentiator is the isolated ground is,
Hmm.
in hospitals, occasionally I've seen some other colors of outlets. Is
Right.
that what do you know about that?
A building as big as a hospital is not only going to have its own grid feed, but they are going to be running off of transformers, which isolate them from the grid, the greater grid, and their grounding is exceptional. It's got to be above and beyond. Um, they do use isolated ground outlets in hospitals for sensitive equipment and stuff.
In home studios or even in commercial studios, how often is it really necessary to have an isolation transformer?
If your power is clean enough and you plug things in and it's good to go, uh, then you wouldn't need one. Generally, in a bigger facility, just as part of the engineering, you're going to have an isolated isolation transformer built into that if you're building a studio from scratch. If you're moving into an existing building, I mean, hopefully you can maybe at least isolate the grounds. Another option would be like having a power box in your live room that is essentially a power conditioner. It plugs into one of your outlets, and then the band plugs into that. That could help.
Kinda like those Equitech boxes we were
It
talking about.
Yeah, exactly. But generally in a larger facility, it's gonna be engineered to have an isolation transformer.
If you're at a club and the performer steps up to play and they're holding a guitar and they touch the mic and they get a shock off the mic, what's the cause of that?
It is a grounding issue. I couldn't tell you exactly what's going on there. Maybe somebody lifted a ground where they shouldn't have lifted a ground, and suddenly you're completing the circuit with your face and the microphone and comes to really bad results. Yeah.
Different clubs could have different situations where a piece of gear could be not grounded or plugged into an outlet that's improperly wired or whatever.
Right. Right.
Is there a difference, what would you say, a two-prong outlet? Is there, any kind of polarity difference that matters when it comes to plugging something in?
So you've got a hot and a neutral. If those are reversed and your equipment depends on that being proper, that can cause some difficulties. Absolutely.
Most cases that doesn't that's preventable because in two-prong outlet situations, one side is bigger than the other and
Right.
prevents that.
Right.
Do you have any experience, in seeing the aftermath of a lightning strike on an electrical system?
Ooh, I have not.
Okay, and do you have any thoughts on what is actually happening in that situation if lightning strikes and there's a surge in the system? Like, what are the main causes of surges on gear that
Right.
causes them to get damaged?
Well, that's where surge protectors come in handy for that. I think it's just a matter of if the lightning hits the right place, it's just going to create a voltage surge in your equipment, and it could fry all of your pieces of gear on that line if you don't
Didn't
have a surge protector that will
Yeah.
shut it out.
Would an isolation
Mm.
transformer help prevent that too?
Um, maybe. It's hard to say because that is an electrical issue, not a physical issue. So if you've got a sudden power surge on one side of the transformer, it's going to affect the other side of the transformer, and y- basically you would want some sort of surge protection on your equipment side.
What are the things that you do at your studio to ensure that stuff works correctly and gets what it needs and you have a clean sounding system?
Yeah, I've got isolated ground outlets in there. That's my control room. My control room is fully isolated. All the outlets are isolated ground. Everything is clean inside my control room. Outside, I have not gone through and replaced all of the outlets, but I've got 2 circuits feeding my control room, so I find if I run a extension cord out from my control room into the main into the live room, and everybody plugs into that, then I get clean power. So, I just again, I should schedule myself to come into my studio and,
You should call that
isolate my
guy.
Yeah, exactly.
So the majority of the work you do as an electrician, I know I've asked you this before, but just for the audience, is it primarily commercial or residential?
Both. Yeah, I do commercial and residential. I would say it's about half and half.
And are they great? Are they very different from one another?
Residential's generally more Romex wire, a lot less metal, but every once in a while you do have to run stuff in conduit. And again, that's like your setup. We had to run the power on the outside of the house to get to your room using conduit. The isolated ground is separate from that conduit. The conduit itself is still grounded, but your isolated ground is separate from that, so you're not getting any potential RF frequencies that come in through the conduit feed. Commercial is usually more MC cable, which is a metal clad cable versus Romex, which is uh, it's got some sort of plastic coating on it. So again, when you start using more metal conduit, MC cable, that's where an isolated ground really comes in handy. So you want to bypass all of that metal, which could create an antenna to bring in noise to your system.
Do you end up doing a lot of, cleanup work for other electricians, over the years? Like, have you come into situations where you're like, "Who did this?"
It does happen every once in a while. It it's rare that it's another electrician that I'm cleaning up. It's usually like a homeowner or a DIYer that just threw something together because they knew what to do. Enter the internet. There's a lot of good information on the internet. I'm sure there's a lot of bad information too, but there's more good information so people can actually look up how to do stuff right. So that's helped big time. But
Interesting.
yeah, so it's rare, but it does happen. One thing I thought of is if you're setting up a system, say in your house or a shop or something like that, and for some reason there is noise that's not you can't do anything with. Um, don't panic. Hire somebody to come out and test it, and there's probably a pretty easy solution. Hopefully, it's not an expensive solution because if you are in an industrial area and you do need to add an isolation transformer, that gets expensive. But generally, especially for a residential studio or a small commercial space that's maybe one room, there's usually a pretty easy way to get around. Add some sort of system protection that'll clean up your power.
What should the traveling audio professional do? Let's say they're in hotel rooms or Airbnbs, and they're not in properly built studios, but they're actually, like, traveling with their family, for example, and doing, "Oh, I gotta make a mix update or master update."
Right. Generally, if you're doing stuff in the box, you're fine. There's no external gear or electrical stuff that's gonna bring noise into it. If you are bringing preamps with you, like say you want to record somebody in a hotel room, you're generally probably gonna just plug into one outlet.
Mhm.
in that respect, it's probably good to have some sort of power conditioner in your rack that everything plugs into. But generally, if you're plugged into just one outlet, you're going to be fine. There's not going to be any ground loops or anything like that going on.
At the risk of alienating a group of people, let's talk about audiophiles for a second.
Okay.
So I mean, and I'm just kind of repeating things that I've heard. I've seen situations where people will sell you a power cable, an IEC power cable that is supposedly worth $1,000 or $500. You know, there's like some kind of extraordinarily high price associated with it. What are your thoughts on that?
If you got the money, go for it. I there is going to be a difference, whether it's noticeable or to anybody's ears is debatable, but there is going to be a difference between the low oxidized copper that comes right from the mine. I don't know what they're selling, but there is a difference. Like I said, if you're that rich and you have the money to, sure, do it. If you're
Whatever
not,
what
don't
what
worry about it. You're gonna
whatever
be
makes you
fine.
happy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because I've had people say, "Oh yeah, you can sonically hear a difference between, spending $5 to $10 on a power cable versus, $150 a foot for this kind of power cable."
Yeah. I know the difference is measurable. Whether you can hear it or not, I don't know. I've never done that listening test, so I can't tell you for sure.
And in the 30 years that you've been doing this, has there been much change in either code or techniques or quality of product or change in product that you've noticed in the electrical world?
The codes are changing every, oh God, what is it? 3 years, 5 years? Practices change, grounding changes. The biggest thing that happened in my career span was adding arc fault breakers to panels, just extra protection, extra things that can go wrong, but extra protection. But yeah, different wiring methods that have come and gone, practices, things do change, supposedly get better. If they don't get better, they change again.
Yeah.
So it's a living system, I guess, the electrical codes that are being produced every so often.
And when somebody, sets up, let's say somebody buys a house and then they turn the garage into a studio.
Mhm.
Is it unheard of to have a whole separate feed come in for that studio? Meaning, when I say feed, like, let's say there's a breaker box for the house. Do
Mhm.
they ever set up a second breaker box for the studio? Is there an advantage in that or a reason for that?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, you're basically just gonna need 1 or 2 circuits. I would run a clean, isolated ground circuit from your breaker box to your garage.
Mhm.
That that'll help ensure that you're separated from the rest of the house. But yeah, no, I don't see any reason to add a separate, sub panel, let alone a dedicated ground.
If you're a renter, your options are limited, obviously. You can't call the electrician and or could you to have, I mean, I guess you could in some cases upgrade the, two-prong outlets to three-prong outlets.
Right, you would wanna get your landlord involved in that, but yeah, I mean, if you worked with your landlord and said, "I really need these upgraded," maybe they'll pay for it, maybe you can share the payment, but really, if you're a renter, you wanna get your landlord involved with any work you do on their place, because legal issues.
Probably the best case scenario there is once again just surge protectors and or one of those, transformer based boxes, the Equitech boxes. I think they come in 15 and 20 amp variants.
If you're gonna go with a isolation transformer, toroidal transformer thing like the Equitech, those are quite expensive, but they're quite effective too, so
Yeah, does Equitech is the only name I know. Is there other
yeah,
companies that do that?
I'm not sure they're the only one I've run into. Maybe they just have the biggest name in the business, but I'm As far as that audio specific technology goes, with the voltage difference in your hot and your neutral. But if you're going to get into bigger building isolation transformers, there's a lot of companies that do those.
And I know that this is, I don't know if these two things are like oil and water, but is the term DIY and electrical interchangeable? Like, could you, with the help of an electrician, build your own like version of what Equitech does?
Oh gosh, possibly. Uh, you have to really know what you're doing. I mean, people do hand wire their own transformers. It's a very small niche of people, but they are out there. But
Okay.
I've never done it. That just seems way too tedious when you can just
Just buy
go
the
out and exactly.
off the shelf product and,
Right.
wow. Well, did we leave anything out that you think is important for people to know?
Maybe safety first. You don't want to really mess around with your high voltage. Get somebody who knows what they're doing, preferably a licensed contractor, electrician. Because if you don't do it right, it can cause gear to blow up, fires to start. You want to do it right. It's that important.
Now, I feel like I won the lottery with you because you're an audio professional, and so you have that understanding. Do you think there's things that electricians who are not audio professionals don't understand?
Probably, just the noise, issues with pro audio gear. When you get into isolating grounds, it's a very rare situation where you want to actually do that, i.e. hospitals, audio visual, facilities, server farms. So probably most electricians haven't experienced that, but there's so much information out there on how to do it, and anybody who knows the industry should be able to figure it out. But yeah,
Do the codes vary much state to state in that you're aware of?
a little bit. So there's the National Electrical Code, which is the basis for everything. That's the you don't mess with the National Electrical Code. California does have its own code. I'm sure other states do as well, which just adds above and beyond things from the National Electrical Code. So you do have that, but as it's my as far as I know, no states have yet gone, we don't need that National Electrical Code stuff. We're just gonna do away with that and just, yeah, do whatever you want.
And I'm sure it's very different in states that like look at a state like Louisiana. Like, if you're in New Orleans where the water table is much higher,
Yeah.
it really raises a lot of questions for me, like, well, how do they deal with that? Or how does a country like the Netherlands deal with, they're really good at they're like water professionals in terms of managing what they have. And I think they've advised Louisiana and New Orleans specifically on how to deal with water. So I wonder how they deal with electricity over there.
That is a great question. It sounds like a whole nother research project. I now that you bring it up, I am curious about that, but I couldn't tell you how they do it or
Right,
what they do
because
separately.
right, if you're a studio in New Orleans and you wanna run a ground rod, like,
Right.
how does
Yeah.
that work
Um,
with moisture?
well, salt water actually adds to the grounding capabilities, so you're gonna get a better ground rod. It may disintegrate faster than normal, but yeah, salt water actually will give you a better ground than regular water.
And final question too, if you do have isolated grounds and, I've got them here, so let's say we're good, but then let's say the neighbor decides to, I don't know, put in I don't know, I'm guessing like an arc welder or some kind of intense industrial piece of equipment in his garage. If he does that and it starts to bleed into the system, can you retroactively add a ground rod to an isolated ground system?
Yes, you can always add a dedicated ground. Even if that happened, especially in a residential setting, one piece of equipment like that shouldn't, in my opinion, create that situation.
Mhm.
But if for some reason it did, and you never know, electricity works in mysterious ways sometimes, yes, you could add a separate ground rod.
Okay, and I said that was the final question, but here's the real final question.
Okay.
How many times have you been shocked doing your job?
Probably 3 or 4 minor times and 1 really bad time where I probably coulda died, but I didn't. I was working on a 277-volt system, an exit sign as a I was an apprentice at the time, and, the journeyman said, "You want me to turn that off for you?" And I said, "Nah, I got this." And, started twisting the wires with my one hand, and I thought I had my other hand behind my back, but I was touching something metal, and, suddenly I couldn't move, and things were starting to go black, and, one time, before that, thankfully, some electricians were talking, one day about, if they get when they got hung up, the first thing they did was stepped off the ladder. Thankfully, the first thing that came to my mind was step off the ladder, and I was only a couple 2 or 3 rungs up. Stepped off the ladder. Luckily, I got the signal from my brain to my feet to step off the ladder and, broke free, and I kinda heard myself going, "Ah," as I fell off the ladder, but I broke free. I was fine. It went from one hand to the other through my heart. I was sore for about a week after that because it really constricts your muscles. But I lived. I'm hopefully stronger for it. So that was the worst case, but then, you get little shocks here and there.
And I'll leave us with this gruesome story. I worked with a guy, when I worked in pro audio retail for a period of time in San Francisco, I was working at a place called Audio Images, one of the 2 places. There was Audio Images and Cutting Edge. I worked at them both.
Oh, yeah.
And, at Audio Images, the tech there told me the story that his I think his dad was working at a PG&E substation.
Oof.
So, for those outside of California or those, outside Northern California, PG&E is Pacific Gas and Electric. That's our utility company up here. And in these substations, I mean, you know better than I do. I'm assuming, like, that's where all the big shit happens.
Yeah.
All the power's coming in there and things are being moved and
Yeah.
regulated
That's where the high voltage is coming into, yeah.
and there was a guy, I guess, that got electrocuted and but, like, on a heavy voltage thing, and it completely burned him up, and he turned
Yeah.
into dust, like, right then and there. That's how
Yeah.
bad it was.
Yeah. That's high voltage will do that to you. It's not pretty. I've heard some really horrible stories
Ugh.
throughout my years too. Yeah, it's nothing to mess with for sure.
So now that I left everybody with that image,
Right.
call a professional,
Yeah,
consult your electrician, don't do this stuff on your own if you don't know what you're doing, and don't watch YouTube videos to think you know what you're doing. Call the professionals who know the code, who know how to deal with this shit, so
absolutely. Good advice.
well, on that note, Mike, thanks so much, for sharing these bits of wisdom with us. I hope it's useful to everybody, and I love talking to you about this stuff because
Yeah, me
it's
too.
just entertaining and fascinating to me.
Cool. Thank you, Matt.
All
Always
right,
a pleasure.
take care.
All right, you too.